Chapter 14. Tracking a Husky. Pete and Pam bent down to pick up the 3 puppies. "Oh, you poor things," the girl said as she cuddled them. "You look hungry." "They need some raw, fatty meat," Pete observed. "Remember we learned that when we were studying about Eskimo dogs." The children were tempted to take the puppies home to feed them, but decided to bring the food to the barn instead. "We'll hurry right back after breakfast," Pete said. "Look, they don't want us to leave," Pam remarked, as the fuzzy little animals nuzzled closer to her. She laid the puppies back in the straw and piled some of it around them to help keep the animals cozy. Then she and Pete hurried back to the cabin. Mrs. Hollister had prepared a hearty breakfast, bacon, eggs, and toast for them, and as they ate, the older children told about the discovery of the 3rd puppy. Ricky grinned. "Yikes," he exclaimed. "If we wait long enough, maybe the whole barn will be full of Eskimo dogs." After breakfast, Pam asked for meat to give the pups. Her mother smiled. "You'll find a fatty piece of beef in the refrigerator, dear. Take that." As the children trudged up to the old barn, Holly asked, "What color is the new puppy?" "Gray," Pam told her, as Pete opened the door. Suddenly, Ricky said, "Good joke, we fell for it. 3 pups, eh? There are still only 2. Pete and Pam stared at each other, saying this was no joke, there had been 3. Quickly, they searched the barn, but the 3rd puppy was not in it. All the children looked around outside. The little Eskimo dog had vanished. "But why," said Sue, "would his mommy bring him here and take him right away again?" Pete frowned. "I just hope nobody stole the dog," he said. "Stole him?" the others exclaimed, and Pam added, "Maybe we ought to guard the barn." "That's a good idea," Pete agreed. "Let's talk to Dad about it." Pam gave the puppies the meat she had brought. Then the children hurried back home. Graham was at the cabin, saying she thought it strange that the Greeble brothers had been away from their cabin since Sunday evening. "They may have had to go a long way in their search for Mr. Travers Nelson," Mrs. Hollister remarked. "No doubt," Graham said. The older Hollisters were very interested in the story of what Sue called the coming and going pup, and Mr. Hollister offered to stand guard during the morning. "Suppose Holly and Sue come with me," he suggested. "While we're watching the barn, we'll make a big snowman." By 12 o'clock, they had built a tall, fine-looking figure that gleamed in the sun. All this time, there had been no sign of a visitor to the barn. Mr. Hollister said that he and his daughters should return to the cabin now. It was lunchtime. When they arrived, Pete said, "Pam and I'll take the afternoon shift." How hungry everyone was. Each member of the Hollister family ate 2 helpings of the delicious chicken fricassee and apple pie. Ricky was the first to finish and asked to be excused. He put on his jacket and boots and hurried outside. While Pam and Holly were helping their mother wash the dishes, they heard a noise under the floor. Then came a muffled shout from Ricky. "It sounds as if Ricky found something in the cellar," Mrs. Hollister smiled. The family soon learned what it was. Ricky burst into the kitchen breathlessly. "Guess what?" he cried out. "There's an old dog sled in the storage cellar. Come on, Pete, help me pull it out." "I think you'd better ask Gramp about that first," Mrs. Hollister advised. "Maybe he's keeping it there for a special reason." Ricky dashed out the door and raced to his grandfather's cottage. In a few minutes he was back again, more out of breath than he had been before. "Gramp," the boy gulped excitedly, "said we could take the dog sled out. It's a Comatic, like you hitch huskies to." "I wonder where he got it," Pam asked. "From an old trapper," Ricky replied. "Gramp said he put it away and forgot he had it." All the Hollisters hurried outside, and Ricky led them to the door in the side of the house, which opened into the storage bin. He and Pete dragged the komatik out. "Isn't this swell?" Ricky cried. "It's wonderful," Pam exclaimed. A harness was attached to it, and as Pete examined the thongs, he remarked, "Do you remember, Pam? This is called a gang hitch. We saw pictures of it in the school's library books." "Let's make believe we're Eskimos and take a ride," Holly said, jumping onto the sled. "All right," Pete agreed. "Ricky and I will pull you girls." This proved to be hard work, and presently they stopped. Ricky said, "Say, Pierre has 2 Eskimo dogs. Maybe he'd let us hook them up to this komatik and pull us around." The others thought this would be fun, and decided to ask the boy when he came to work. As if in answer to their wish, they suddenly saw Pierre coming through the woods and ran to meet him. He explained that school had closed early because of trouble with the stove. "That's good," said Ricky, not realizing how this sounded. "Pierre, could we borrow your dogs to pull our komatik?" The Canadian boy smiled. "Indeed, yes. My huskies used to work in a dog team. They'll know just what to do." Pete and Ricky went with him to get the dogs. When they returned, all the children talked to the handsome animals and petted them. Pierre harnessed the dogs, then said, "All aboard! Who wants to ride first?" It was decided that Pierre would drive the dogs and give Sue a turn first. The little girl giggled and screamed in glee, "I'm an Eskimo girl!" as the komatik went in a circle around the Hollister cabin. Then Holly took a ride, and Ricky was next. As Pierre brought the dog sled to a halt, he said, "Pete, how about you driving? Give Pam a ride." Grinning, Pete stepped onto the back of the komatik. Pam seated herself, then suggested they ride to the barn. She explained about the missing pup to Pierre, and said she and Pete were going to watch the place. Pierre said he would follow and bring the dogs back. "This certainly is a mystery," he remarked. "I hope you solve it this afternoon." Pete called out to the huskies, "Mush!" and away they started. Upon reaching the barn, he said to his sister, "Boy, this was great. I'd like to drive a team in a dog sled race someday." Pam smiled at her brother as she got off the komatik. In a few moments, the others arrived, and Pete slid open the barn door. A gasp came from the children. There was only one puppy left. Pam looked fearfully at Pete. "We shouldn't have left this place unguarded a moment." Sue began to cry. "The poor doggie's been stole by the bad men." Pierre looked puzzled, so Pete told him the story of Stockman and Gates. He added that the children were suspicious that the Griebel brothers might be the bad men in disguise. One had the nickname of Stocky. The older boy whistled in amazement. As he and the younger children got ready to go back to camp, Sue grabbed Pam's hand. "Don't let the bad men get you," she begged. "We won't," her sister promised. "Pete and I will come and get Dad and Gramp." Sue felt better, and seated herself on the komatik for the ride back. After Pete and Pam had been left alone, they walked around to see if they could figure out who had been there. "No footprints," Pete said at last. A little later in the afternoon, Pam said she thought they ought to leave. At this moment, the children were standing near the snowman behind the barn. Pete grabbed his sister's arm. "Look," he whispered, "a dog." A beautiful buff-colored Eskimo dog with a deep chest and large, fluffy tail was making her way to the barn. As the brother and sister looked on excitedly, the dog went through the opening between the clapboards and disappeared inside. A moment later she emerged, with the puppy held firmly in her mouth. "Oh, I'm so happy she came after her puppy," Pam said. "Let's go speak to her." Pete held his sister back. "She might be the famous Fluff," he said excitedly. "She looks like the one we saw on TV." "Yes, she does," Pam agreed. "Suppose we follow her," Pete proposed. She might lead us to Trevor Nelson. Hopefully, the children dashed after the husky, keeping far enough behind so she would not become suspicious. Her tracks were easy to follow whenever they lost sight of her. They hurried along for nearly 15 minutes. Then the dog led the way down through a little gully filled with snow and big boulders. The animals suddenly vanished. "How are we going to get around this big rock?" Pam asked. Pete put his hand to touch the huge rock. A startled look came over his face. "Pam," he whispered hoarsely, "this isn't a rock, it's the wall of a cabin." His sister stared in amazement. Then she noticed a place where the snow seemed to glow a short distance away. Her heart pounding, she stepped closer to it and beckoned to her brother. "Pete," she said in a low voice, "this is a window that's covered with snow." For a moment, the two children conversed in whispers. Should they try to find the dog, or should they look inside the strange camouflaged cabin? "Let's peek in," Pete suggested. Pam put her mitten to the window and brushed away some snow. The children peered inside. They gasped fearfully at what they saw.